All right. Welcome to the Craniotomy podcast with AlexanderHerman, our psychiatrist, myself, the neurosurgeon, and our esteemed guest, Dr. Becket Ebitz. Welcome, Becket, to the podcast. We're very excited to have you talk about all sorts of things today, but appreciate your time on this Friday.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here and glad it's Friday.
Yeah, me too. Do you want to introduce yourself a little bit, Becket? Just where you're at, where you came from, whatever.
Sure. I'm assistant professor in the Department of Neuroscience at the University of Montreal in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. I did my postdoctoral training at the University of Minnesota, down the hall from you guys. And then before that, I did postdoctoral training at Princeton University and Stanford University. I got my PhD, working backwards in time completely, from Duke University. And before that, I did my undergrad at a tiny college that no one's ever heard of called Simon's Rock.
Mm.
Yeah. It's named after the imaginary friend of the founder's house.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
Our small college.
Wait, the friend was a rock, or?
Yeah, the friend lived in a rock. I think someone decided to build their house, and rather than build a house with 4 walls, which, requires building 4 walls, they built 3 walls and then used the rock. It was a very big rock as the 4th wall. So there, in the woods behind the college, there was a rock that had a chimney on the side of it. And so that was, yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you. Let's see. We meet on such a regular basis that when I think of things, ways to get the conversation started that seem fresh. But I don't know, maybe it would help if you just kind of talk about what are the kinds of, scientific questions that you like to think about now.
Sure.
And how did you come to be interested in those kinds of things?
Yeah, I think a lot of what I'm interested in is how the brain does new things. So things that we've never done before, like trying out, new ways of thinking, new kind of actions or thoughts, or, whatever kinds of processes our brains are capable of engaging in. And I think that's a really hard problem because our brains are very good at doing the same thing over and over again. It's actually really, I think, good for us to sort of save energy when we can, right? And so using these like well-worn pathways through maybe neural activity space or something like that can be a really sort of efficient way to navigate the world. We don't have to spend that much time trying things that could turn out to be disastrous because we can just try things that we know, are good patterns of thinking. But I think it's also easy for those patterns of thinking to actually be bad, right? So if we have like negative thoughts over and over again, or like, a tendency to use drugs or, do other things that are sort of getting in our own way, it can be really hard to break out of those patterns. And so for me, thinking about how we do new things is in part about, discovery and learning and creativity and, all of this like beautiful, positive stuff. And then also in part about thinking about how we can help people who are stuck in ruts that they would rather not be in.
When did you start to kind of, some of those questions I think are very natural, right? I'm sure on some level everyone wonders how we are able to do new things.
Yeah.
But when did you start to coalesce around that, maybe like perspective on your work or that line of inquiry, I guess?
Yeah, I think that's a tough question. I've definitely always been interested in, I would say, creativity as like a thing. Like, why are some people more flexible than other people? Why are there circumstances where we're more flexible than other circumstances? And so in my very early graduate work, I sort of started looking at the role of oxytocin, which is this like social hormone that's, connected to arousal. It's released when we get like nice social touch that we're excited about, or we get eye contact from, a person or a dog or, someone we care about. It like relaxes our body, and I think permits us to engage with the world in ways that feel more fluid and relaxed. And so thinking about that and how that was actually changing the behavior, what I did was give oxytocin to a bunch of monkeys and then look at how it impacted how much attention they were paying to other monkeys. And what I found was that there were changes in how noisy the behavior was, right? So how much variability there was from moment to moment. And I just got maybe obsessive. I fell into a rut about the noise. I got really obsessive about understanding why there was this trial to trial variability, this, why there were these fluctuations that we couldn't necessarily understand or predict. And then that sort of spiraled out into, really spending probably the last 15 years of my life, like just trying to figure out the neural basis of that kind of noise, of that kind of variability from moment to moment in the way that we respond to identical circumstances. I think that gives us a really powerful way to sort of isolate some of these higher order processes, like our capacity for flexibility and creativity. If we can get a person or an animal or whatever to do the exact same thing, so that we know that like the neural signals that we're looking at are not due to maybe changes in what they're looking at or how they're moving or, these low level physical things, but are really about these higher level cognitive processes. So that's really what I do, is to try to clamp everything constant and get people to do the exact same thing for reasons that can be more flexible or more, stable, more habitual. And that allows us to really isolate those cognitive processes. I think I sort of went far afield. I started with why and ended up with how.
I think there are like a few threads there we can pull on throughout the conversation, but one I'm really curious about that I just know nothing about is like what is the literature on oxytocin and cognitive flexibility, and maybe you want to like introduce the notion of cognitive flexibility and connect it to explore exploit, just so for our audience they can get some get their bearings. And then I'm really curious to know if that's something that's been followed up on and what we even know there.
Yeah, I wish I knew the answer to that. Actually, unfortunately, I've kind of moved a bit away from the oxytocin literature. I ended up getting interested in sort of other things. It's something I'd love to go back to at some point. That stuff is really fascinating, and I think our social interactions can have such a profound impact on how we see the world and respond to it, and in so many different ways. And I think understanding the mechanisms for that is probably really important, especially, like right now where people are dealing with social isolation and like really seeing how that's affecting their thought processes. And I feel like it's such a powerful time to be thinking about those kinds of ideas. Unfortunately, I don't have an answer to you, for you. So one thing you asked is about cognitive flexibility and the connection between that and maybe exploration, which is maybe more precisely what I do, is study exploration. So cognitive flexibility, I think, is the ability to, well, for me, I think of it as change, right? Your ability to change what you're doing from one moment to the next, which is maybe different. So other people have different definitions. So for some people, cognitive flexibility might be your ability to like recombine two ideas in some new way, right? Or it might be your ability to take an old idea and then split it up in some new way. It's really about, I think, your ability to manipulate things. But I think for me, the bit of cognitive flexibility that I think is really important and maybe underappreciated is that the new part means that you've changed something from where it was before, right? So there's an inherent like temporal aspect to it, no matter how you define the cognitive flexibility. It has to be some sort of big change that went somewhere new. And so for me, I think thinking about time series and how things evolve over time is really part of the key to understanding cognitive flexibility. Yeah. So I think I separated your question into two separate questions, maybe, but there was probably a third in there somewhere, but I lost it.
No, I think that's great. I think if you just want to introduce the kind of this explore exploit dilemma, that would help. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So the explore exploit dilemma is this classic distinction that I think appears in a lot of fields, but I think most classically in computer science. So the idea is that you're trying to make a little artificial agent that can navigate a world that it really doesn't completely understand. It's impossible for it to completely understand. You've made this little computer program and you've dropped it into a world, and so it doesn't know anything about the world. So it has to now figure out the structure of the world and figure out how to do whatever it is you're trying to get it to do in the world, right? So it turns out that in order to do that, you actually have to use a mixture of different strategies. It's not actually sufficient to just do the thing that you already expect will be rewarding, especially because your knowledge of the world is not perfect. So you have to balance, using the information you have and trying to do the things that you think are the most rewarding, if you're the little agent here, with also engaging in periods of learning and discovery and like trying things out that you don't necessarily are expected to be rewarding. And I think for this dichotomy to really make sense, you sort of have to start with a particular assumption, which is that, we do things because they're rewarding, which maybe is something that we could argue about whether like all behavior is necessarily motivated by reward. But I will say that this is something that maybe neuroeconomists and people who study decision making use the word reward in a way that's a little bit different than the way that people typically use it just in their daily lives. And so there's a definition of reward within neuroscience and within psychology that is whatever motivates behavior, right? So anything that motivates behavior is by definition rewarding. So it ends up being like a little bit confused, because maybe then discovery and learning is rewarding in some sense.
Yeah.
So it's kind of hard to really think about these things.
And that seems almost like a tautology on some level, right? Like we're going to
Yeah.
And it sounds very positive, but in truth, reward can certainly be negative.
Sure. Yeah. Reward can absolutely be like avoiding something that you don't want to do, that's unpleasant, or you can find that successfully evading a shock is probably pretty rewarding.
Yes.
Yeah.
One question I often have, because I wonder this about myself, is how much do you think about, I guess, how much does your own experience, because these topics, they seem so natural, like they're a part of, our own lives, right? And I wonder, how much does your own experience with, thinking about your own explore-exploit balance, or the explore-exploit balance of people around you or people in your life, does that actually play into how you think about the kinds of scientific questions you study, or are they pretty separate?
Yeah, for sure. We were talking a little bit about oxytocin, and I said something about arousal, right? So when you have a nice social interaction, your arousal relaxes, right? And you're in this less reactive, responsive state. And for me, arousal is also really strongly connected to exploration and exploitation, whether you're in this regime of flexible learning and discovery, or if you're in this regime of habit. And I think there are lots of ways that people think about mapping these ideas onto each other. But for me personally, if I think about when I'm the most flexible versus when I'm the most rigid, I think it's going to be a little bit counterintuitive when I try to explain it, given sort of the words and the way that I've been describing things so far. But I think that when I'm really, really worked up, so when my arousal level is really high, I'm actually kind of more flexible. So that feels counterintuitive, because you would think that, like, you know, you would want to be relaxed in order to like engage in learning and discovery, and that when you're really aroused, that kind of doesn't really work. But part of that is due to what I think of as the opposite of exploration, right? So the opposite of exploration and discovery is like rigidity. It's these like really, really rigid patterns of thinking and being. And when you're super like worked up, when you're, you know, there's a tiger coming at you, or like for me, I live in Montreal. So when I've just avoided being hit by a car is something that happens to me fairly regularly. I'm not in a habitual state at all, right? Like my senses are like completely alert to the world around me. I'm paying attention to everything. I'm learning so that I can figure out what it's going to take to not get hit by a car tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
You know? So there's, for me, like I feel like I'm in this state of being like really optimized to take in new information, and to, in fact, not do whatever habit I had going into it. So if I was having a particularly anxious day and maybe having some like thoughts, like repetitive thoughts, and then a car almost hit me, those thoughts are gone, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's sort of the way that my intuition for part of my work comes from. Yeah.
So in many ways, you know, there's some clear, you know, somewhat of a connection to sort of the cognitive energy that is required by you. Then is sort of one way that you're kind of linking it, and maybe it's not 100%, but in many of the cases, there's sort of an energy that goes into exploring.
Yeah, Alex and I have talked about this a lot, and I think we've debated it a lot. I don't think I think we have some ideas about how we could go about actually testing it in like a really rigorous way, you know, and obviously we'll talk about this more in the future. But that idea that, like, I mean, it's kind of inherent in the words, right? Like if you're stuck in a rut, right, you're stuck, right? You have this intuition that you're maybe in some kind of a valley, right? Where your ability to get out of that valley or that repeated flow of whatever is restricted by something, right? And then so to get out of that, like energy, you would think, like, sort of obviously is required. You need someone to come in, pick you up, and shove you out of the valley so that you can escape and end up in some new space. And I think arousal, I mean, it makes sense, right? All of your organs are getting supplied with blood when you're in a circumstance where you're under threat. Your heart rate picks up, your respiration picks up, your pupils dilate, you start sweating, and all of these things are extremely metabolically demanding, right? Like you're burning calories all of a sudden as you start becoming more aroused. And it makes sense that, like, maybe you would want your brain to burn some more calories too in that moment. But you can also imagine the opposite thing, which is that you have a finite amount of, you know, calories that you want to burn, and because your body needs it to escape, you know, this car or this tiger or you know, this angry person or whatever it is, whatever the source of threat is, you might redirect the energy out of your brain and to your body, right? Mm-hmm. So it could actually be that, like, actually implementing these valleys in our brain, these stable patterns of activity, maybe that requires energy, and maybe, you know, when we need that energy to do something else, that's part of how we eliminate those thoughts, because, you know, suddenly those resources are needed elsewhere to keep us alive. You know, there's no point in me worrying about something if I need to be fleeing something.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's interesting. Some interesting dynamics between what could be sort of summarized as stress, you know, the impetus to change, whether that's internally, you know, mediated and requires energy, or just correlates with energy oftentimes, is a really interesting, I think, concept, because that would sort of imply that if you were a person who was stuck in a rut and you wanted to get out, you have to apply energy, but not in just a cognitive way, but in potentially more than that, as a means of change that is, you know, potentially, I don't know, somewhat hardwired to be facilitated.
Yeah, there's actually some nice work from Josh Gold's lab at UPenn that I think has messed with this, where they've like just played like an unexpected sound, right? Which is it's not like a cognitive thing. It's just like a little thing, but it allows people to learn faster. You know, and it's kind of cool.
And is that like a marker or a perturbation on the system that somehow,
Yeah, I think that's kind of a perturbation. I kind of want to, because David, you raised this like point about stress, which I think is like another thing that I know Alex and I probably spend a lot of time talking about and thinking about, that like that there's like different ways of conceptualizing stress. There's the acute stress of the car that's, you know, about to hit you. And then there's the like chronic stress that you're under, you know, day after day. And maybe that connects back to sort of the COVID pandemic and all of that stuff. And I know this is something that Alex spends, and you both spend a lot of time thinking about, like the effects of this kind of chronic exposure to stress on these behaviors. I mean, maybe you guys want to chime in and like think a little bit about like the differences between these different kinds of stress, or like, and they can also influence each other, I think, probably in weird ways, right? That like if you're under chronic stress, then your response to acute stress might be different.
You know, I will admit I am no expert on stress, and my conceptual framework on stress is so rudimentary that I will freely admit that the way I think about it in many ways is the flip side of stress, which for me is exercise. And it's not a one-to-one mapping, but for me, it just makes sense. So, you know, with acute exercise, it can often be very beneficial to exercise intensely for a period of time. But there are many times where you have to exercise intensely that can be harmful. So in no way does it necessarily mean it could be good or bad. But that kind of stress is just, you know, motivating change of some kind. But the chronic stress, you know, there's sort of an optimal amount of chronic stress, just like there's an optimal amount of chronic movement. There are some people that have to work really hard and wear their bodies out to the point where they end up with just terrible, you know, joint pains and things like that, and just wear everything out. But if you don't move at all, and then you end up with similar sort of issues. So there's sort of this optimization problem that, you know, just sort of built in. There's some amount of optimal stress that sort of can facilitate growth and potentially positive change over time. And then there's too much or too little. And and that's my very, very rudimentary understanding of, you know, the overview of stress.
Yeah, I really like that. And especially like where, if you're thinking about like the interactions between the two, if you imagine that there's like maybe an optimal amount of stress, and then you can imagine that's maybe the region where like acute stress, you can actually respond the most adaptively and appropriately to acute stress. If you're like really, really under stressed, then you might like not know what to do when you get, you know, an acute stressor. And if you're really, really overstressed, you might just be saturated to the point where you can't, you know, what are you going to do?
Good. Yeah, that's very good insight. I think that's.
Yeah, I mean, and we often, you know, naively, at least with the small stress study we've done, we had the hypothesis that more stress would correlate with more exploration, for instance, right?
Yeah.
But maybe, you know, what really matters is what your starting point is, and then how you respond to the stress, right? Exactly what you're saying, which obviously we would need a different and bigger, you know, to assess that. But, and I think that's much more interesting anyway, that, you know, some people probably are over exploring in response to stress, and some people are under exploring in response to stress, or something like that.
Yeah.
That's modulated by their the level of chronic stress they have.
I would love to dig into that. I think like knowing the interactions. Well, I think there's like some first order stuff to get through too. Just like sort of knowing how people respond to chronic and acute stress separately. And, you know, I think you've got some nice preliminary data on the chronic stress part, but it would be interesting to know about the acute stress part, and then the interactions. Obviously, that would be really killer. I'm
pretty sure that Nathaniel Daw, that their group found that acute stress leads to over harvesting, right? Which I guess is related at least to over exploitation, but
that was the temperature stress model.
Mhm.
Was that it? I can't remember, but
Wait, temperature stress, like
Yeah.
literally put them in a heat room?
it's like put your hand in like a bucket of
Oh.
ice water or something.
yeah.
Okay.
I don't know. Maybe that's a different one. Maybe that's a different model than he
No,
used.
but that's a great stressor. That's
I think they used a Trier social stress. I don't even remember actually, but yeah.
Yeah, that's another really good one where they sort of ask people to prepare a public talk or something like that.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, that is very stressful for everybody. Yeah.
One thing I like about this sort of explore exploit paradigm, and similarly this sort of relative stress model, or I'm not sure how you would frame that, but one thing I like about it is there's not really any kind of right answer. It really is just a hugely dimensional problem that allows for very diverse solutions that are potentially equally matched. It's just very exciting from that point of view.
Yeah, I think that's one of the really wonderful things and disappointing things about biology is that, like you said, it's so high dimensional. There's so much stuff going on. It all interacts in like so many complicated ways. Like, we've talked about like neural mechanisms. We've talked about bodily mechanisms. We've talked about neuromodulatory mechanisms that like oxytocin that might mediate the two, and we've named like a couple of small examples of each of these things, and there are like zillions more, and they're all interacting in like all kinds of really. And so how do you ever know that something is actually causing something else? Or how do you actually understand how these pieces fit together in a way where you feel like you actually understand the mechanisms, that it's this that causes this, that causes this behavior? And I think having that causal understanding, that's what we need to know in order to actually impact people's lives, right? That it's not enough, if I flash a light or whatever, I can't necessarily make a light just follow someone around flashing a light when they need to learn faster, right? Or playing a sound or doing something like that. That it's possible. Like with wearable devices, I think there's so much that you can actually do, but they have to be aware of the environment, and they have to have an understanding of how all of that stuff about the body is interacting with the high dimensional environment now too that they're interacting with. I mean, it's just a really complex problem, but it's at the same time, you can put a stimulating electrode in someone's brain and like restore reduce their depression, right? We have no idea why. So I think that's part of the beauty of biology also, is that you can just go in and do things, and sometimes miraculous, unpredictable things happen, and then you get to spend decades figuring out why. Yeah, if you like to be confused, I highly recommend biology.
I mean, that's like, it sounds like one of those great advertisements, but just replace biology with like being human in life,
Yeah.
It's a confusing process, but sometimes it's rewarding,
Yeah, I like that.
So I sort of got this hint, Becket, that you were starting to apply how to use the explore-exploit paradigm to researchers that are using the explore-exploit paradigm to figure out sort of causal relationships in biology. That's kind of where I was like worried that you were headed, and I was getting locked up. I was getting locked up. Yeah.
That absolutely is part of the advice that I give my students all the time is like, you have to make a decision about, you've now put this much amount of time and thought into this project. This is, what you're in the habit of doing. Is it worth keeping on, or is it time to try something new? And the counterexample also, that like, not only do you have students who will keep throwing themselves into something that's not going anywhere, but you'll have students who cannot throw themselves into stuff that can go somewhere. They just are so interested in novelty and discovery. I'm probably that latter type of student myself. I was probably a bit difficult to keep on track, coming up, but it takes all kinds. And I think that's part of the reason why I'm so excited to see stuff like you guys having a team, right? Like this move that we're seeing in science towards having people with different ideas and different personalities and perspectives working together to solve problems. You know, I would love it to have someone who's maybe a little bit more exploitative around me, just to like, you know, get me to focus.
This might be the wrong group for that. But.
Yeah, that's just the wrong group. That's why we have Seth, Becket.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's very hard to, because we're all attracted to people who like think the same way that we do and get excited in the same directions. And like, if I'm excited about something, I definitely don't want someone to tell me, no, you need to finish this thing that you're working on. Yeah.
All right, we're getting a little bit too close to home. So
I wanted to ask a little more, and maybe this will just get edited and rearranged, but I was thinking about this notion that like being in a rut is doing the same thing, and that often feels easier, but sometimes persistence is hard, right?
Yeah.
And persistence takes energy. And so how do you think about the difference between persistence, which feels at least effortful, and the habitual behavior that is actually an energy minimum, or, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I think what you're saying is exactly like, so I definitely was on the side of thinking that like exploration and discovery was going to be the energetically costly thing. But I think like you sort of bringing this kind of stuff up is really part of the reason why I'm now completely bewildered by this question. I don't know whether exploration is going to be more energetically costly, or whether exploitation and persistence, you know, in the face of not consistently getting reward. You know, some of the stuff that we do that is habitual, you know, maybe it was rewarding at some point, but at this point, you know, we're doing it for other reasons. Like if you get yourself up to go run every morning, right? Like, you know, you're not doing that because every run is an amazing run. You're not guaranteed that it's going to be a rewarding experience. There's something else going on there. And I think there's a lot of people working on those questions, like this kind of self-control, persistence stuff. And I think it's important. But as long as you're giving me like a platform, the only thing that I would want to say is I don't think that's the right way to think about drug addiction now. I think, yeah, for me, that's, I think, really important. That I think a lot of the funding that we have for studying self-control is actually coming from the National Institutes of Drug Abuse. But at the same time, like, I think as a field, neuroscientists have moved beyond this like moral failing model of addiction, where, you know, people are addicted to stuff because they don't have, you know, the self-control or the cognitive control to escape that. I think that drugs have powerful effects on the brain that are biological effects that, you know, so their effects and people's addictions can't be mediated by some moral failing. You know, it doesn't make sense that, you know, there's something psychological standing between a drug that's directly acting on receptors in the brain and our desire to have that drug act on those receptors in the brain again, right? So for me, I think that's my hang up with the self-control research is I think because of the funding priorities, you know, where that money is coming from, I think it's been connected to drug abuse in a way that doesn't ring true to me. But in the context of like thinking about how we persist in something that's hard, thinking about self-control as like a positive thing that's worth cultivating and worth understanding as something that could be important for resilience, that could be important for like getting through difficult times in your life or achieving goals that are really far-flung and far off. I think that's really interesting. You know who I think should be funding self-control research, who actually has a self-control problem right now, is AI. Like so I think I talked a little bit before about like having an artificial agent who's doing something, but one of the major problems in AI is coming up with a way of getting an agent to navigate an environment where rewards are really sparse, where they're very, very hard to come by. And I think that's the sort of place where understanding biological self-control, persistence, our ability to keep trying something, like a specific plan, despite the fact that, you know, rewards are very rare, that we encounter them we may not encounter them for like 10,000 time steps. How do we maintain some policy for 10,000 time steps if we don't know if it's going to be rewarding or not? And I think if we understood the biological solutions to that,
that's really, I mean, integrating the moral failing seems very ridiculous. That sort of point of view is just clearly flawed, but coming at it from the explore exploit sort of paradigm brings up like a ton of issues. One is, do we see sort of changes just in that paradigm for diseases like addiction? And clearly, I think probably we think we do. It has nothing to do with moral failings, and it really just hopefully reflects the biology in a sort of direct way. But I think sorry, I'm losing my thought. But on the other side, one of the things that I haven't heard, even though it's really rudimentary, is a lot of the time when you're talking about persistence, there's actually a set amount of work that is involved. There's actually physical work. Like, so you want to go for your run. There's physical work, which has a whole sort of, maybe intrinsically valued, but, a significant amount of work that also involves sort of cognitive effort that seems like it would factor in a model, something like that you do oftentimes, Becket. That would make more sense.
Yeah. There's work happening in multiple different dimensions, I think, at the same time, right? So I think in terms of like physically what you have to do with your body, like there are some things that can be, extremely demanding, but also extremely relaxing, like mentally, right? Cognitively. And I think running is probably a good example of that like most of the cognitive effort involved in having, an exercise practice of some kind is probably getting to the point of getting it started. And then once it's started, even though the amount of physical effort that you're doing is sustained, for 30 minutes, the amount of cognitive effort is over, right?
Man, I don't know. If you've been on a run with me, Becket, I feel like I'm dying the entire time. So it takes a lot of cognitive effort to keep going.
I think I've just chosen physical activities that I find pleasurable. So
fair enough.
Yeah. But that's awesome. I should maybe not be surprised that a neurosurgeon puts himself through some very punishing runs.
I should be rewarding though, right? And I guess in some sense, sometimes it is, but I think that's a very interesting sort of way to think about a lot, about this sort of paradigm and its sort of relationship to things like addiction, or like you were saying, for an AI to solve a problem that has a reward so rarely seems almost, I don't know, it's almost like biological lottery that we're sort of hoping for, which probably pushes against our sort of natural tendencies to avoid things that seem so unlikely to happen, and persist at something that seems so unlikely to happen. But that matches, I guess, a lot of the real world problems that people face that come about so rarely.
It's a risky strategy for an individual, I think, to have the ability to persist in something that might be a terrible idea. But we're not individuals also. So because we live in a society and because we can use language to communicate with each other, if I persist in some ridiculous thing, maybe one could argue that I am doing exactly that because I am a neuroscientist. And I've spent a long period of my life focusing on something that has some nebulous amount of payoff. I don't know yet whether it's going to be valuable to the world or not. I hope someday it will be. But because I have this ability to communicate to other people, I can take all of my persistence and then use it to help the society that I live in. And so I think maybe this is one of the really unique things about people is because we and maybe this is part of why we're able to have so I have to back up 8 million steps here, but so humans have a really elaborated prefrontal cortex, right? So compared to primates, this is one of the major specializations. And at the same time, one of the things we know is that as you move forward in the prefrontal cortex, that brain tissue becomes capable of sustaining things over longer and longer periods of time. So sustaining arbitrary brain states for longer and longer periods of time. So we think that, I don't know if it gets up to the point where like we're explaining how you can maintain a stable goal for years, but we're probably, you can maintain stable goals for increasingly long periods of time as a human. And maybe that goes along with our ability to communicate with other people, that like I can go try something and everyone in my group can benefit from my knowledge because I can share that with them. So it's also less costly if, I happen to die along the way, the rest of the group is sort of going to be okay. I cohabitate with people who share my same genetic material, so my genes can go on. I think there's definitely some debate about whether kin selection is a thing that happens, whether people do things that would sacrifice themselves in order to benefit, their direct offspring for sure. But their brothers and sisters or the children of their brothers and sisters, I think that's still an open question. But, so maybe on the individual level, it's costly, but at the group level, it might actually be really adaptive. There's also debate about whether there is population level selection at all in evolution, but I take everything I said with like a pound of salt, probably.
Yeah, I mean, I am aware of the not controversy, but the ongoing debate over kin selection and population selection. But at the same time, the level of diversity we see in nature, to me, really biases me towards believing there must be some kind of population level or kin level selection. Because otherwise, I just don't think we'd see the spectrum of diversity that we see. But I mean, that's a very naive and uneducated opinion, obviously.
No. Yeah, Nicola and I actually spend a lot of time, Nicola Grissom and I at the University of Minnesota spend a lot of time thinking about this in the context of inter-individual variability and like exploratory decision-making behavior and everything. And I think if you imagine that you can explore by having different kinds of people, right? So part of the way that we explore is by just having different kinds of behavior, right? We try new things. We introduce a lot of variability into the space of our actions or our thoughts. Instead of being in a particular valley, we're like exploring an entire plane of possibilities that like stretches out, imagine the West, right? So if you can imagine the same thing happening at the level of a population, that you have people who think differently, who try different things, have different interests, are variable in different ways. And I think there is some compelling evidence that if you have a sufficiently heterogeneous population, then the entire population actually deals much better with change. So it's kind of like a tragic story because you're going to lose half of your plane of people, right? Like there's a catastrophic change in temperature, and so everyone who's not adapted to that new temperature is going to sort of die. But because you had that heterogeneity, you can really quickly move the entire population to this new set point for temperature. And it doesn't have to be temperature. It could be, it probably is going to be temperature. Just
right.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. So if there was a equilibrium for explore exploit around certain sort of frameworks, you could imagine that there could be some evolutionary pressure that may manifest as disease states in modern society.
Oh, heck yeah, for sure. Yes, absolutely. I mean, disease states are not discrete states almost all the time, right? Like there's always going to be some overlap, and a lot of times it's actually something that doesn't even have to do, particularly in I would say psychiatric illnesses. The thing that makes the difference about whether you're in a disease state or not is not so much about the severity of the symptoms, so much as how much they cause you distress or how much they get in your own way. So they're kind of like orthogonal axes in some way, the way that, not completely orthogonal, obviously, but I think that maybe this variability is really important. Like I think about schizophrenia, for example, right? Like there's this sense that like people who are sort of on the edge of schizophrenia maybe have more creativity going on, like artists or people who are bipolar, are tremendous contributors to our culture and like really push us as a society, I think, in new different ways. And in that sense, like not only are people who are sort of in these states, in these extremes, like actually giving us the heterogeneity that we need as a people to survive an insult. Like you can imagine that something could happen in the world where the ability to be a lot more flexible suddenly became really, really important. Like, imagine that there was suddenly like the rate of change in the world suddenly increased a lot. It's not then people who are a lot more flexible would do better. And maybe the people that we currently see as pathological in the sense that they have schizophrenia would become people who would be better adapted to that world. I can't imagine exactly what that world would look like. But I certainly know people with schizophrenia who I enjoy very much as people, and always find talking to them.
No, me too. And just to make a the link here kind of to medicine, that's why really working with people, to the degree to which people are care seeking as much as possible is so important to me. Now that does get complicated in conditions where there's this, we talk about a lack of insight into the problem, or people are unaware of the stuff, the causes of the suffering they might be experiencing at least. But even there, just focusing on what the individual wants for themselves and what their own goals are is just so critical.
Yeah.
And I think understanding neurodiversity is and the reasons for it, and the fact that it's probably essential to like our society, to biology, and certainly to humanity, has really helped me appreciate that and understand that a lot more.
Yeah, that actually, like, hearing you talk actually makes me imagine some kind of a future for mental health treatment that isn't so much about changing the individual as it is about changing their environment to be like better adapted to them.
I was just thinking about that, and there actually are some examples of that. There's this, and I think it might be in the Netherlands. There's examples of a village, for instance, where the whole place is essentially set up to allow people with psychotic spectrum illnesses to live, not institutionalized as part of the community, and from my understanding, it works really well, and it's a much better way of life for those people. And I think those models are hard to scale, obviously, but I think you're totally right. We really need to be thinking about how to change environments, change our world, so that people who are kind of out on the tails in whatever dimension of the neurodiversity spectrum, can have a habitat that they're able to really thrive in and I guess be happier in, or whatever.
Did I ever tell you that I used to work at Gold Farm? Have you heard of Gold Farm?
I don't think so.
It's a working farm that is also a mental health rehabilitation facility. It's a really interesting place, but so it's actually staffed by psychiatrists and like people who are qualified to treat mental illness, and then a lot of the people who work at the farm and who work at the farm stand are people who have schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, other kinds of significant mental illnesses, and that environment, I think, ends up being, or my experience of working there through college and was that there's like a lot of good structure that I think can sort of make up for a lot of stuff. There's a lot of physical activity, like, so you get up and physically do things, and there's a lot of community, right? So you interact regularly with other people, you eat all of your meals together, and it's less maybe isolating than I think the experience of a lot of people who are dealing with significant mental illness in our society today. But that just seems like the base that we can do, right? Is like, right. But I think like moving into an environment where we're like actually appreciating people's strengths and figuring out how we can like use those strengths, that's a much harder problem. But I would love to see people like figuring out exactly what like one of my jobs at Gold Farm was to try to figure out what to help people find jobs that they would do that would be like appropriate for like where they were at in terms of their skills and everything. That was incredibly difficult to do, right? Like you might have to try a few things to like find something that made people happy, that they were good at and that they found satisfying. I think I would love to see like, or maybe that's what I should have been doing with my life instead of this is thinking about what people are good at.
But to bring that full circle, I think that very idea of being essentially what we would call a manager at some company, I think extends in this way, but the framework by which you can do that in a neurodiverse population is by, I mean, from my perspective, one of the ways is to be extremely conscientious about how you're measuring neurodiversity and how you're developing tools in order to elucidate sort of this heterogeneity, because it's not clear when you're just, if you were at somewhere like, Gold Farms, where you have a population of patients with schizophrenia, exactly what that looks like, because a manager would require those tools to sort of make those decisions. You have to have some way to understand the dynamics of people and their strengths and weaknesses and all that kind of stuff to make those decisions efficiently. And I think things like the computational modeling that you're doing with exploit dynamics, that is exactly that.
Yeah, I think absolutely. But maybe like the one tweak that I'm like realizing in this conversation right now is that like so much of that stuff is focused on deficits. It's focused on the ways that people lag behind. And I think we should be focusing on the things that people who are diagnosed with these conditions do better, right? Like
for sure.
That's what a manager does, is focus on the strengths, not the weaknesses. Right? Yeah.
No, that's a great point. Yeah.
I just need a life manager. That's really what it boils down to.
We're kind of running out of time, but I wanted to ask you about like embodied cognition a little bit, and in the sense that, whether or not you think, or what your, I guess, thinking is about the difference between exploration, like in a physical action space, versus mental exploration. Are these like ultimately the same? Is it the same underlying machinery, or is it?
I think that's tough. I think embodied cognition gets a bad rap, like as a term. So some of the, not all, but some of the stuff that's about embodied cognition is sort of not great science. And so I think as a result, like the term itself has taken on some negative connotations within the field, but at the same time, everything is embodied. Like, to believe that the brain can be separated from the body seems bizarre to me. Like, I know this is like a classic philosophical idea. Like, this is Descartes, right? That there's a distinction between the mind and the body. But I think neuroscientists should maybe not be Descartian, because we look at the physical biological substrate of thought, of mind, of cognition. So just given that fact, I think we should probably accept that there isn't, there is a blood-brain barrier, but it only protects the brain from like being doused with molecules, right? It doesn't actually prevent thoughts from impacting the rest of your body. And I think there's great evidence like that you see all the time of like someone records a neural signal of something and like, okay, this is the signal of this cognitive process. And then it turns out that like the rat's whiskers were twitching a little bit, or their neck was like tensing up or something like that. And I don't know about you guys, but like when I'm thinking, it's often affecting my body, and my body, is often affecting my thinking. If I'm on the phone listening to someone, it really helps me to just pace for some reason. I don't know why, but I listen. Yeah. And so I don't think there can be really like a dualism there. I think they must be connected and they must be understood in connection. But technically, that's really hard to do because we need people to hold very, very still so we can look at their brains.
Right.
Right.
Well, and this is what I was going to ask about, is because, in our experiments, for instance, some of the ones we do together, we want people to have a very low dimensional motor output, right? Like we want everything to be communicated by pressing a button or, eye movements or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But at the same time, when we evolved to be, doing everything in a much higher dimensional, or somewhat higher dimensional, I guess, physical space.
Yeah.
And
Not
so
anymore. Now that we're on Zoom all the time, it's pretty much that, right?
Well, that's what I was going to get to. Then Zoom,
Sorry.
the metaverse, video games, all of that actually is a collapsed physical action space. Anyway, yeah.
I feel like you guys just went well over my head on that.
I messed it up. My apologies.
Oh, no. It's great. So wait, sorry, what were you saying, Alex?
I guess I'm just wondering if the kinds of exploration, let's say generically, are really the same if they're being, actualized through a very low dimensional motor.
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah, I think we've officially moved into the philosophy of mind.
Yeah, maybe too much. Yeah.
No, I don't think it's too much. But my answer is going to be too much for sure, which is it really depends on how you define same.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if the same involves the fact that you're like moving in the world or not moving in the world, if the qualities of the things that you're trying to compare include the thing that is different about them, then obviously they're not the same. But if you are okay with like a restricted enough like definition of something and you do see similarities there, like if you see the same patterns of neural activity that permit mind wandering versus like physical wandering in some space, then I would say that the neural bases of those are probably pretty similar. Mm-hmm. But fundamentally, they're obviously different because in one case you're like sitting on your couch, and in the other case you're exploring the world around you. Yeah,
there's like two threads there, Alex. I think the understanding that the metaverse, as you bring it up, this sort of like it's basically reducing like the physical distance metric. It's like it's trading effort for distance in some weird way. Like you're not moving at all, but you sort of get to explore all of these other spaces where there's not any movement. Mm-hmm. And that's some goal-directed behavior of our society to minimize physical activity and to reduce barriers, that are associated with movement, I guess, and open up new worlds. But, that is like a very weird extension of how like the circuits of the brain exist outside the brain.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's some really beautiful stuff on that, like on our ability to, have you guys had David come on yet? I'm sure he would love to come explain all of this stuff.
Not yet. No.
Yeah. But there's some really beautiful stuff on simulating past or future events that or events that haven't happened. On like when Ben came on, did he talk about like counterfactual stuff? And
I think a little bit, yeah. Ben was actually talking about like psychiatry in the wild and in hunter-gatherer, from what I remember anyway.
Cool.
Yeah, that was just one part.
That's the part I remember.
No, that's great. I think one of Ben's results that I really love is that even monkeys are capable of thinking about things that have never happened.
Right.
Yeah. And I think, David would be a good person to talk to about simulating, it's not just simulating like some moment in time. It's like simulating an entire sequence of events or actions, some path through the world that you're not actually engaging in. And I think there are a lot of like really compelling ideas about why we might want to do that. I'm definitely not an expert in that space, so I'll probably say that it's fun to think about why we would want to like have that capacity for simulation at all. But I don't think we actually know the answer. We don't know what it's good for right now. And if it serves the same purpose as like navigating in the outside world, but is maybe like a more physically, let's say, a less physically demanding way of doing that, right? Like maybe if you have a sufficiently good mental map, if I have a sufficiently good mental map of old Montreal, I can go visit anytime I want without having to, do the 45-minute walk all the way down there. I could probably just take the train.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for joining us today, Becket. It's a super exciting conversation. I think we barely even scratched the surface, so we might have to have you come back.
Yeah, no, it's super fun to talk about these things and to have a chance to talk about them, I think, in a more free, kind of fluid way than we normally have a chance to. So,
Yeah, sure.
Very cool.
Thank you.